chose it was because even though it starts off in Barbados, that it ends up on the east coast of Canada, and so that was sort of the context for why I chose the book. But I would love, Franklyn, I had also just told you that, like, normally I kind of hope that our questions will end up in a place where we talk about, like, why is this an interesting or important book for folks in the United Church to read? But before we go there, I'd just love to know your initial response to the book and what you liked about it or what was not great about it.
Okay. The first thing, as I mentioned to you, moderator, that I'm not a novel person. I like books that have me intellectually stimulating and wrestling with philosophical ideas and theologies. And so that's where I like to sit. And so when you offer the invitation, I'm like, And I said, why not accept this invitation and the challenge within the invitation? So I got the book, and when I opened the book, the experience is different. Normally, I would go from head to heart. This book, you feel it before you think about it. And this book happened, this is what happened as I read. I was very invested to see what's going on. Take me through emotion of anger, frustration, especially in the sense you're reading about a Black person, right? A slavery experience. So it was tangible. I could relate to the Black experience, but also there's this sense of simple, what's the word I'm searching for? Naive simplicity in Washington Black, right? So that grasp and hold on to me. And if one should answer the question how such a book fit in the Canadian context, there is sometimes a sense of naive innocence that plays out. And so I go through the book. So that's the first thing. It hits my feeling. And I sit with that, and then I start to think about the main impact that the book starts having on me. And one is it asks the question, what is freedom and what is captivity? Right? So that was the first thing jump out of me. So when they had the accident with Philip, right? And Titch decide that he will rescue Wash and take him out Barbados, right? Part of the book, he was trying to encourage Washington to be free, go on his own. And even when Washington was on his own, he was still in captivity. He still wanted Titch to be his master. In fact, when Titch said, you can get your freedom, he said, yes, freedom from your brother and to be your slave. And so that hits me. I mean, you're getting your freedom, but at the same time, you're enslaved by the very system that you're in. So I find that freedom and captivity dance playing, how is one free and how is one still in captivity? The other thing that impacted me was the complexity of the relationship. Washington say, what is the relationship? At first, if as you read the book, you'll notice that Titch seemed to be a savior, right? He's rescuing Wash from his brother harsh treatment, and he's teaching him to read and doing all these things. But as the book progressed, and it seemed like Titch is giving Wash his freedom, but Wash read it as Titch wants to get rid of him, that kind of thing. So the relationship was one that is fraught with tension and what exactly is it, which resolved in the end unsatisfactorily. I don't like how the book ends. I need more. I want more, right? So the freedom and captivity question that comes in, and then the complex relationship between a slave master and a slave, that was really impacting for me. It raised the question of privilege, power, and the limits of equality right in that decades and time. And the freedom and captivity part mentioned, I'd say it explore what it means to be free, both in body and in spirit. The third point, yeah, I like to make notes when I'm reading. The third point is identity and self-discovery. And so as Washington journey, it wasn't about a physical escape, but he needs to escape mentally from it. And right through the book, you realize that when he started to search for Titch, and even his girlfriend Atana was saying to him, why do you bother? And I was saying the same thing. Come on, you have your freedom. You know, leave Titch, let him do what he does. You go and do what you do. And so he has to find his own identity, which he gradually come into himself and self-discovery. And the nice part was curiosity and science. You know, Washington, he once he start learning and he start to get into it, it helps him to move beyond the trauma of his past. And so that was really exciting to see him do that. Think something I could relate to that happened is the trauma and the scar. Remember when they were trying to get this balloon to do its first journey, and there was an explosion and Titch face was damaged. And so he has the trauma of that, the trauma of his experience with his mother, big kid, just like I saw it first when I did the first reading at about chapter 9, 8, 9. And she said, my son, my son. But it's not until I get to the end that the picture was like, that's his mother who broke 3 of his ribs. So you have the trauma and the scar on his face. That scar that goes with him, and it plays out both literally and metaphorically, because I could feel that walking into a new place as a Black person. Slavery is not yet free. And then here I am with my scars, with my internal scars, navigating the world. And so a book that came to my mind when I reached this point is Maria Lunes in Playfulness and World Travel, in which she learned how to be playful as she navigate the different part of the world. So those are 5 points, and I enjoy traveling from Barbados to the Arctic, to Virginia, to Nova Scotia, Canada, and just following the experience. So it was a wild ride that I did not anticipate. You know, it hits me from the emotions, and then I start to process what was going on. So indeed, so yeah, that's my first impression of the book as I read it.
I had a very similar response to the journey, right? Because I read it knowing that Esi Edugyan was like writing from a Canadian context. So I was surprised to open it up and see like, oh, we start in Barbados. And then but this adventure that's not like if I think of the novel Homegoing, and there's like some pretty pretty explicit scenes about like coming over as part of like the slavery in the cargo ship, and which is a different type of journey than the journey that Wash was on in this book. So it was like completely unexpected, because I think, you know, we kind of expect to think about there's a pretty prescribed trope about what it means to be a slave who's experiencing the transition to freedom in literature so far. And I think that, you know, this wild adventure that happens is completely unexpected. And then also that even when he lands in Nova Scotia, like you can be free from slavery, but you're not free from racism, right? And that was really, really visceral to me. But it also reminded me of, I have a friend at the University of British Columbia who teaches history, and teaches specifically history of the Pacific Northwest. He's non-Indigenous, but he's done a lot of work with Indigenous communities. And he wrote, I think it was like can't remember the title of his book, but Indigenous London or something like that. And he wrote about the history of like in the number of Indigenous people that traveled from North America to London, either as oddities or because they had and they were put on display for like a cultural uh, as like a living cultural artifact of you know, these barbarian cultures from North America, or they had like intermarried and were sort of became adjacent to British society, and sort of people looking the other way because they weren't really you know, acknowledging that so and so explorer's wife was Indigenous or whatever. But these really fascinating stories of the ways in which for a very few number of people there were these experiences of like very cosmopolitan experiences of not necessarily being a part of the gentry or the nobility in European culture, but became adjacent to it somehow. And the tension of that, like being next to but not a part of like white European culture as North America was colonizing. And that kind of thread really was strong for me. You mentioned at the beginning that there was sort of a naivete that you think you experienced in terms of like contemporary Canadian societies. So can you say more about that? Because I think
Yeah.
that's it.
So, yeah. So the naivety is there. People have a sense of what is happening, right? But there's a naive innocence that that is all there is, right?
Mm,
And because of that naive innocence, for example, in the context of racism, one would believe that because there's multiculturalism, right,
right.
that that dampens the impact of racism. No, it doesn't. It put people's in different lanes, and as long as you stay in your lane, everything will be okay. If you try to come out of your lane, like when Wash was trying to date Dana, and one of his friends said, "You dare not approach her. Do not um, go and see her ever again, because you know if you do that, you're crossing the lane, you will get yourselves killed." And he probably stopped seeing her for a few days or a few weeks. So that naivety of refusing to look beyond and stay with that innocence on the surface, I believe what it does, it perpetuates kind of racism or modern day slavery that we don't really see it clearly because we are riding on this simple naivety as I described it, as I look at it. So that's how I see it
Got it.
and believed
So
it to be.
like if I think of some of the stories that I've heard since I've been moderator about our attempts to and our shortcomings in becoming an anti-racist and intercultural church, it would be like you know, hearing about somebody's congregation sponsored a family of refugees from West Africa who then connected with the West African community in their city, who then started wanting to come to church with them, to the church that had welcomed this one family. And like one family was okay, but when the whole community of West Africans showed up, then it was just like, well, we have to teach them how to worship like us, or like somebody needs to teach them to be quiet in church, or somebody needs to teach them to show up on time, or the whole region is affirming, can't they go worship in another affirming congregation?
Yeah,
So like exactly that thing of like the racism doesn't exist when we stay in our lanes, but then when we bump up against the actual cultural difference, or the constraints of societal institutional racism, then you realize, oh, that's not totally accurate.
right. And we still have it that if we have, say, a high influx of a particular immigrant group into a conversation, then the dominant group takes time to start going to that congregation and into another congregation. So that is still playing itself out. And so you can, there's a lot of nuances and shade. The author tried very best not to give, say, really to play the violence and the impact of slavery down. But when you read it, you can see
Yeah.
the violence that happened, the incidents that happened, being beaten almost to the point of death, being hunted because he was in the vicinity of someone who killed themselves, then the blame shifted to him. So there are those hard pieces that when I read it, I'm saying we still have these experiences if people from particular immigrant groups or migrant groups find themselves in certain places based on association, then they will find themselves in negative circumstances or even pain. So those nuances, the way she weaves them and plot them, if you're an intentional reader, then you start to pick up the nuances of slavery and history and its impact. And
Yeah.
so, mhm,
I also like the idea of us reading a book about slavery because I'm not sure how many of you watched my installation service in August of 2022, but I had asked my friend Vanessa Richards, who's a beautiful singer, if she would sing something at my installation. And so she talked about the cultural roots and the way that the song Kumbaya has like been anglicized to be a word that that seems to be nonsensical, but actually comes from an accented um, way of saying "come by here," right? And then ended by like her introduction to that talk saying, slavery is alive and well, and there's 40 million people estimated to be living in slavery today. It's just not the same systematic, like where the system is underground and that human trafficking is like tolerated and not
mhm,
prosecuted, and far exceeds like this
mhm,
sort of um I guess now like stereotyped idea of like the transatlantic slave trade in the first
mhm.
400 years of North American
Yeah.
expansion from Europe.
Yeah, I agree. And the book is a good read because it's a soft entry.
Mm,
Because many times someone read a book, they'll be traumatized by the graphicness of the content.
yeah.
And so this book is a good entryway. It's soft enough to balance out one's emotion and the shock impact, but it also has the edge in it that it stirs one curiosity to find out what was happening there and what was happening there. So,
Mm,
and to pick up on a point that you mentioned about modern day slavery, um, recently I was reading a book, Police in Black Skin. I think that's Police in Black Skin. And one of the things the author mentioned is that immigration, the way migrant workers are treated, is a form of slavery, and that
mhm,
we need to look how we treat migrant workers. So that plays out a lot too. So yeah, so I would recommend this book for use in congregation because it's really a nice soft entry, and then it has
yeah.
the edge to nudge people to do further research as to what happened here and what happened there
Mm.
and things like that. So
Yeah. I'll put the link in the chat. It's Policing Black Lives, I think, is the book that you just read on. Um,
yeah.
so I put the link for that in the chat, but I'll also add to the chat in a minute. Penguin Random House, which is the publisher of the book, actually has a 14 question guide to like as a discussion guide for book clubs that I think would
Mm,
also be good for congregational use. But it says the novel, one of the questions is the novel is set between 1830 and 1836 and takes place on multiple continents. How
mm,
are the larger global and political tremors shaking the world during this time felt through the characters? For example, Titch is described as an abolitionist and often derided for it. How does this aspect of his worldview affect the way he behaves, and what are your perceptions of him as a character? Because I kind of like I struggled with that. Or I was like, sometimes I was like, oh, like he really is like he really does want abolition, he really does want freedom from slavery, and also he's such a like wealthy white dude. Like he
Yeah.
can't escape from that reality either, like of like
Mhm.
extreme privilege.
Mhm.
And I thought it's very easy for somebody of that amount of privilege to, like, he wasn't, he has this one kind of intimate relationship with one person, but he's not like back in England or even engaging with the colonial government in Barbados or anything to like fight for abolition. He just like doesn't believe in slavery.
And that points to one being conflicted between where one sits in life and how one do the work of social justice and outreach work. I think it lends itself to that because I did look at it and there was one part mentioned that he was doing some work with, I think I forget, was it an abolition company or when slavery abolished? And I did look and said, okay, he wants to do that work, but he's restricted. He's ridiculed by his brother. Is Philip question him? Um, People look at him when they're walking as if he's crazy, but there is no mention that, um, hey, let's take this on a bigger scale. Let's shut down the plantation. Let's challenge my brother. Let's challenge my mother. None of that happened. And I see that plays out in the Canadian context. So because persons are friend with me, they have no other Black association and they make no intent, no move to reach out to other Black. And they think they are doing the work for racism because I'm their friend. And I said, no, I'm one person. There's a whole lot of work to do. So I can really understand Titch's dilemma. It's no one wants to be a social outcast by
Mm.
associating with certain migrant class of people. No one wants to disturb their social relation by being too intimate and too close. So one can understand Titch, but one can see it plays out even in today's society.
Mm. You just reminded me of like, we have a large number of communities of faith across the United Church of Canada who have sponsored refugees from other countries, and um, that it's good and important and great. And also, I know from working alongside staff here in the general council offices that there's often conditions attached, like we want a family with children, and maybe those children will attract other children. We want people who are Christian, not Muslim. We want, we've agreed with Immigration and Refugee Canada to like be one of the sponsoring organizations for rainbow refugees who are usually single or coupled, but like don't necessarily have children and whose lives are like most in jeopardy in the context where they're coming from. But like congregations don't want to sponsor those people because they're single, and there's not necessarily a guarantee that they'll go to church, even if we're accepting, it's an affirming congregation that has largely welcomed other folk from the LGBTQ community. And then, um, watching one of our colleagues here in Toronto, I'm not sure how many people here tonight are from the Toronto area, but last winter there was a situation where there were, I think, close to 300 or 400 African refugees living at Pearson Airport, and then an equal number living on the streets downtown because they had made it to Canada on a refugee visa, but then the city of Toronto said we're not, this refugee situation is a national problem. And then the shelters that are provincially funded said, well, we're not spending provincial dollars to house African refugees that are a federal problem. And so they were barred from shelters. And so we had a colleague that was going like door to door to different congregations in Toronto saying, like, can people find space for them in their homes? Can people find space for them in their churches? Like, they can't be living on the street. There was a woman who was 8 months pregnant and sleeping on the street in the middle of Toronto winter. And the response was like everybody just sort of turned the other way. And it was like, it was such a different reaction than the kind of wanting to reach out and like plan for a particular, it's almost like an adopted child situation, right? Where like, oh, this is our family that we've picked from this lineup that are going to come and be part of our congregation, as opposed to like actually seeking justice for refugees and creating a space of welcome and stability for refugees. And not understanding the impacts of like not creating that system and infrastructure underneath folks, because if you don't have a phone number and you don't have an address, then you can't make your immigration appointments because the IRC has nowhere to reach out to you. And then people get in trouble and get deported for like not making their appointments that they never knew they had. So yeah, I guess like for me, that's another theme that runs through a book where like Titch picks like this one person, but it like also serves his own purposes. And I see the church doing that, maybe not knowingly, like I don't think intentionally in a way that's meant to replicate that dynamic, but it does happen. And I think it's also it's just like one of the hard layers of the onion that we have to peel back, and dismantling this worldview that has normalized all of this stuff for centuries, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you watched the movie 300?
I haven't
With the
seen it.
hunchback, and he turn around and become a traitor, and then so the army from Persia was destroyed. The army was destroyed by the Persian army. One of the things in that book is that you can probably see coming out in this Washington Black is that the hunchback guy was a depiction of people who have some disability
Mhm.
or different abilities. And so as a result of that, he wasn't included. He couldn't be a part of the army, right? And he was rejected by the society. So he turned to the Persian and informed on his own country, seeking for acceptance. When I look at Pitt and his injury, both his scars and his black skin, and his being rejected by the scar and his skin, it tells ostracization from society based on one various abilities. So that's one of the thread I connect when I read the book, and I said, how do we reject persons with disabilities from our various spaces because they don't seem fit, or we think they are not as pleasing as we would like them to be? The book draws a lot of, you can see a lot of contrast and parallels as you navigate through the different chapters.
Yeah. That just reminded me of one more question in this guide. So, what draws Wash to the beauty of the octopus, and what does it mean for him, a former slave, to capture it and other specimens for study and display, even with the motive of showing people that creatures they thought were nightmarish were in fact beautiful and nothing to fear?
He actually wanted to release it.
Hmm.
He was saying, how could we keep such a beautiful animal? I think at one point they were supposed to kill an animal. I can't remember. Then he said, why not have it in a zoo, or why not bring people to look at it? I forget. But his concern is compassion for the creature taken out of its natural habitat is probably a reflection, I believe, of him being taken out of his natural habitat in Barbados, taken to this strange land, especially when he was in the Arctic, and wondering if he was ever going to make it back home. So,
I had a lot of like just chuckling about new Canadian friends that I know that got settled in Winnipeg or whatever. Like I have a neighbor in Coquitlam who is originally from Rwanda, and he got settled in Winnipeg and he lived there for 10 years, and then he had family that had been settled in Seattle. So one day he went on, or one year he went on a road trip about 4 years ago, just before COVID. Went on a road trip to Seattle to visit his family. And as he drove across the Rockies, he was like, this is still Canada? What am I doing in Winnipeg? And like finished his vacation, went home, like gave up his lease on his apartment, quit his job, and drove back to Coquitlam, and like hasn't been back to the era of cold winters since. But you know, there is this like crazy desolateness to a lot of northern Canada that I think even those of us that live in southern Canada are like not prepared to journey. But if you think about coming from somewhere like Barbados to the Arctic, is like it must have been just otherworldly.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're gonna open up to other folks who are on the call for conversation about 5 minutes. Do you have any like closing remarks or anything else that's come up for you in our conversation that you want to mention before we open it up to questions and other comments?
Let me see. If there's anything I missed. I think I covered all the things that grabbed me. And yeah, so I think it deserved another read. Um, yeah, so we can open the floor, and if questions are asked, it might jog my mind of all the beauty that lies within.
So are you gonna read it again, Mr. I don't read novels?
Yes, because when I read it, I was reading it so fast. And so normally when I read a book that fast, and it's relatively easy to read, it's not hard to read, it's a lot of pages, but the hard copy, I find it, well, because I must confess, I was in Ottawa the day after I received the book and I read the first 100 page, and then they mix up our exit. And so in the mad rush, I left the book in the airport. Yes. So I have to hurry up and bought another copy.
Oh,
And so
no.
I could continue the reading. So my heart is ripped in many pieces for the first 4 days of being in Toronto without my book.
Mm.
Yeah, so yeah, but and then nobody would say, because I had to go back to Ottawa on my return trip, and
Mhm.
it was not in the zone, and nobody has it. It was not at lost and found, and I'm like, the person who find it is unkind. My name is in it, my business card is in it, my church is in it. They didn't return.
Listen, I have no luck. I have left a few things on airplanes in the last 2 years, and I have had zero luck getting them back. I left a copy of Andrew Winston's Net Positive with my credit card tucked in it and my prescription glasses hanging off of the seat pocket, and didn't get those back. And I left my laptop in business class and didn't get that back either. So apologies to all of our faithful M&S donors for having to buy 2 computers for me as moderator. Right, Larry Hale, I assume, sorry. Go ahead, Franklyn.
Larry is wanting to ask a question.
Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, no, it's Franklin. Next time you need to borrow a novel, just ask me, okay? I I had a copy. No, and it's funny that this odd novel was picked. I actually read it back after just it won the Giller Prize, and it really was one that really resonated with me because it was a very, very different story about somebody who, was taken at such a young age, and in those days had his talents recognized. And of course, there's the whole, I'm a professional biologist, and that whole biological angle really resonated with me as well. But to see that the people actually had a chance to be recognized in the face of such a, what's the word? Such incredibly trying circumstances with the nature of the person who quote unquote owned him was quite inspiring. He really rose above you be able to blossom in a real environment. And that to me was a really hopeful part of the story.
Thanks, Larry.
I was thinking, I think that's one of the things I liked about the book. I like nuanced stories, and I think that especially in today's age of like increasing polarization and division, um, to talk about the gray areas in where you think the dividing line is between different experiences of life or different uh positions in life is something that I always find attractive. I think it's because I'm a half-breed, but I was thinking about Scott Lyons, who's a professor of Indigenous Studies in Minnesota, wrote a book called X Marks, which is, studying the treaties where Indigenous leaders had signed the treaties with an X, as a sort of way of signing without prejudice, because not because they didn't know how to sign their names, but they like pretended like they didn't know how to sign their names because they weren't actually agreeing to, or they didn't trust the people who were giving them the paper to sign on. But in that book, he talks about his aunt having had a very like positive experience of residential school or boarding school in the US. And because the impact of colonization and the Indian Wars in her community had made her family of origin so abusive by the time she was sent to boarding school, and she had kind teachers, it was actually a place of safety. And he was like, where does her story fit in this, bad church, good Indigenous people story where actually this is the thing that maybe saved her life. And that doesn't erase all of the horrible things that happened in boarding schools and residential schools. So, Kate said this book provided a glimpse into the cruelty of humanity as longtime immigrants from 1855. We really have no idea of the cruelties towards people of color. Do you want to say more about that? Or does anybody want to build on that? I see Karen. Or should I say the Reverend Dr. Karen Hamilton, former General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches. An excellent lunch companion from Tuesday.
Yes, thank you, moderator, for the lunch rush as it was. Next time, much longer. But thank you for that introduction. You know what? Sort of, it's a bit tangential, and yet it's not. What really struck me, I haven't had time to read the whole book, but at the beginning, which just kept hammering me and hammering at me and hammering at me, was he was always afraid. It didn't matter what happened. When Titch kind of, takes him in or whatever, he doesn't really feel relieved. Like everything that happens, he still remains afraid. And I thought, and I don't know, as someone who is Scottish and white, but the level of fear that no matter what happens to you that's good, and he has enough food and he has a place to sleep and he has clothes now, but he's just always, always, always afraid. And I felt the weight of that, listening to his, from his voice, and what that, I have no idea what that's like, but it really moved me and struck me, and indicated a kind of a depth that I'll never really be able to understand.
Yeah. Franklyn, go ahead.
And thanks for that recollection, Karen. That part was very touching for me as well, and I could feel his emotion. And is the first thing when Titch asked for him, is Big Kit, which is his mother, gave him a nail and said if Titch tried to do anything untoward, he should use that nail that was sharpened. And so it was all the abuse, it's the trauma he's carrying from all the bad things that he was born on the plantation. He was accidentally cut with a machete. He had 3 ribs broken. He saw the slaves being abused. I think he was probably 9 when Titch, or 6 when Titch took him. So he still have all that fear and that distrust that a plantation master could be anything but evil. And in the end, he said, when what's his name? When not Chris Erasmus died, he felt nothing. When Erasmus got sick, he actually wanted him to die. That's how much cruelty he had experienced. And so it's the trauma that he experienced from a child, baby, right up to that point when Teach came. So I felt that was a touching point.
I think it's interesting, Karen, that you picked up on that because, and this also relates to Kate's point. I know I've shared it in a few instances in the church, but certainly not in book club. But when I was on internship, almost 20 years ago, we had read, I was part of my pastoral charges book club, and we read a book by a Canadian author, I can't remember her name, called No Crystal Stair. And it was the experience of a woman who is mixed race, Black and white, living in Montreal, who passed for white. So like, think of Meghan Markle, right? Like she, in certain circumstances, she certainly not in the royal family, but maybe other circumstances, she doesn't like, her Blackness gets questioned. And it was the first time that I had become aware of this genre of like passing novels, of like people of color who pass for white. And somebody in the book club's like, I don't understand, like, what is a passing novel? And I said, well, like, it's like me, like I'm Indigenous, because like we don't in our, I'm legally Indian under the Indian Act, but also in my culture, like you're Heiltsuk if you're Heiltsuk, like it's not there's no like blood quantum thing or like definition of who you are. You're Dolly's daughter, so you're Heiltsuk. I said, but I passed for white. And he said, I don't care what you say until you show up to church with a buckskin dress and a feather in your hair, you're always going to be a little white girl to me. And that was like one experience of like having my indigeneity erased by somebody who is white, and that was like a very conflicted and awful experience. But then also realizing how much I do benefit from white skin privilege and like not being immediately visibly Indigenous according to how people think Indigenous people should look in Canada. And and how much I benefit from that, right? Well, benefit and suffer from it, because also people will say the most like outrageous and outrageously racist things in front of me because they think that I'm not, they think that I'm white. So a friend who's a professor of homiletics in the state that I know through the Festival of Homiletics was posting on Facebook yesterday about their daughter is 17 and is wanting to go to a youth ministry thing on the other side of the state, and it's like a 5-hour drive, and like they're just not ready to let them go yet. And I was like, I moved to Texas from Victoria when I was 17, like of course you can let them go. And then I was like, oh no, they can't let them just drive 5 hours across state because they're Black, right? Like that's what they're worried about, is the actual like they won't necessarily be safe driving 5 hours without an adult in the car. I think that when I see the church struggling with racism and thinking about like the history of racism, the history of oppression in Canada and the US, it becomes like a thing in the past. And what we sometimes don't realize is like that's a real lived experience of especially Black-skinned people and Indigenous women in North America, is that you do live with that constant sense of fear of like, I'm not actually safe and okay just being in the world. And the number of colleagues that I have in the academy that have been like, brutalized by the police for no reason in the States just for being Black, or like, there's a hashtag driving while Black about people being harassed by the police for no reason other than they were just driving a car while they were Black. And then reading a couple of years ago, Helen Knott's memoir, In My Own Moccasins, a memoir of resilience. And it was the first time that I really connected like my own history with risky behavior and use of drugs and alcohol in my younger 20s, and how easily, I think if I'd had a different color skin, how easily much more at risk I could have been from some of the choices that I made, and like connecting that with intergenerational trauma and like all of the woundedness and like confusion and horribleness of like my family histories, and using substances as a way to try and cope with that. But that could, like, if I had been more visibly Indigenous, that could have been me that was on a poster somewhere. And so I think there's a connection there too between that level of like fear and uncertainty of or no assuredness of personal safety when you're a person of color in North America, that is still very real. Yeah. Okay, other questions, comments? Uh-oh, Franklyn, your mic's off.
While they are thinking, following the 7-second rule of thinking before they speak, and the scenarios you mentioned of being weary or uncertain, I like to get up early in the morning and exercise. Since I've been in Canada, I don't do that. And if I'm going to exercise, I wait until I see a group of persons jogging and then join that group of persons and jog. I don't jog by myself. There is this concern that what will happen if someone sees this giant of a Black man running through the community? And what would they think? Would they call the police? And I remember I needed a branch to do an object lesson of church, and a member said to me, she won't be home. So I could go and cut the branch. So I went and cut the branch, and then she said to me the next day, did my neighbors call the police? I said, I don't know if your neighbors called the police. She said once she was away, she was very concerned that I was there cutting a branch from her premises, that someone would call the police. I told her I was aware of it, but because you have given me the permission, I was able to do that. Another thing you mentioned is that someone would say, unless you come to church with your feathers and so on. I saw people look at me directly in the eyes and said, when I see you, I don't see Black. Totally erased me from existence.
Yeah.
And I'm like, then what do you see? I'm looking beyond to see I said, no, the first thing you see is a Black person with all the experience that it embodied. And the next thing you see in interaction is my personality. So that still exists. And I'm wondering if it's politeness, if it's fear, if it's not want to embarrass, don't want to deal with the issue. What is it that led people to look at someone visible, different in color, and in all respect cannot embrace that, look beyond it? And so others might have answers to that, but that's something for us to ponder as we look at the traumas to experience that, not just what, but many migrant persons face as we journey through these strange lands.
So Yvonne, and then Marion Party, and then Carol, if you want to add anything to your written comment.
I just wanted to comment on Wash's determination to connect with Titch. And even though we could criticize some implicit racism and so on, I still I feel that Wash wanted to connect with Titch because Wash started him on a completely different journey in life that he ever would have experienced. So, Titch, with all his limitations, I mean, he tried to stand up to his brother. We can say, well, you didn't do a great job. You needed to be more systemic about it and so on. But in his own way, he tried, and sometimes we have to accept small attempts. And, you know, I think that connection between Wash and Titch was meaningful enough that he was reliving it again in Morocco.
I think that's a good point, Yvonne. So many of you know my mother was adopted as an adult after being fostered by a United Church minister and his family. And so the grandparents that I grew up with were white United Church family. And my oldest uncle in that part of my adopted family married a Jewish woman. And so my cousin, who's my sister, like she's closer to me than I am to my brother, is Jewish and is also like this incredibly brilliant, talented, accomplished entrepreneur and communicator. And so in Vancouver, like the world is quite small, and people will say like, you guys are first cousins, like, and you're both so awesome. So we've been working on this writing project called Cousin Awesome that is sort of like telling the story of being in this like multi-religious, multi-cultural family that is connected to the 60s scoop, and like grandma and grandpa's love for my mother, and also the racism that still existed in that situation, and that my mother's experience of like coming of age in that household also meant that she had access to a future that maybe she wouldn't have had if she'd stayed on reserve, and that impacted the types of experiences that my parents raised us with, and how like the meta narratives of like racism and oppression and people doing racist things despite their best intention in the context of like also love and transformation and stuff, and like all those things are true at the same time, and that like good people can do good things that also have hard consequences, and all of that is true. And I think that that's also very true in this book. And like I said at the beginning, I really love books with nuance, and I think that is why, is that like there is no black and white, to use a very inappropriate analogy, or maybe appropriate analogy. There is no like, you know, like hard and fast binary between what is good and what is bad, and what is freedom and what is liberation, and what is you know, is the relationship between Titch and Wash like actually intimate, or is it still unbalanced? And like all of those things are true, and depending on like all of the different sides of the prism that you can look at it from. Marian. There we go.
Okay, here.
Or should I say the
I'm
very
having
Reverend
trouble
Marian
with
Party?
my volume as well as others, so I hope you can hear me. I have a habit of writing down quotes I want to remember. Oh, the first quote I wrote was on page 28, in which Wash says, "What I felt at that moment, though I lacked the language for it, was the raw injustice of it all." And it seems to me that he was carrying that with him for obvious reason throughout the whole book. That even when Titch is, you know, exercising weird behavior, Wash thinks it's something to do with him and not Titch. And oh, I like the last line. I thought to fast forward, I really liked the last line because it felt like freedom at last. Well, to some extent, freedom at last, because Wash wasn't free because so many of his own people were still in slavery, even though some laws had been passed accordingly. Last line of the book, I really liked, and I was frustrated with it at the same time. And it says, the wind across my forehead was like a living thing. And I heaved a sigh of relief and said, good. And at the same time, I guess the Harlequin romance aspect is in me, although I don't like those books. Maybe the maybe Murder, She Wrote, I wanted as a kind of ending, but it was intriguing.
You wanted things tied up in a neat little bow at the end. Like Franklin, you wanted more.
That's the question I asked was, what did he walk out in the storm and went somewhere? What happened? You know, so I'm like, okay.
Thanks, Marion. Carol, you wrote a comment, although Wash was subject to discrimination, he was still able to have a life of privilege. This was a story. Whereas Book of Negroes was to me a better picture of the lives of some Blacks who came to Canada. Do you want to say more about that?
So many of the books in the book club have been nonfiction. I mean, I think all of them have been. So when I started this, I thought this was also nonfiction. So when Titch took him under his wing and things like that, and I thought, oh, this is a bit different. And I was trying to describe the book to people last night, and they said, this sounds really weird. And I said, well, it kind of, to me, it is kind of weird in that it's not, I don't think, a typical story of any immigrant or of any slave who escaped. And there's big holes in it because we don't know how he got from Virginia to where did he land in Canada? You know, and to,
or something.
Yeah, and things like that. I can't say I was thrilled with the book. I'm glad I read it. But I just, Franklyn, you said it was a gentle introduction. I kind of agree with you because I don't think Wash really suffered. He suffered more because of his face, the recognition, or people when they saw him, they were disturbed or looked away. But I don't, the discrimination or the racism of being Black, to me, didn't come out anywhere near as strong as the Blacks, the Loyalist Blacks, for example, who came to Nova Scotia, settled in Birchtown, and then decided, oh gosh, this is awful. We're off to Sierra Leone, you know. So yeah, it was a different book to read, I have to say.
Yeah. And I thank you for sharing that, Carl. I think that's where the skill of Esi came out brilliantly. Because what she did, she used real life experience and history to plot her novel. So you can see evidence that this story resembles real events, but it is not real event.
Right.
So it's her creativity in plotting it that captures me, you know.
Okay.
You know, if she had said, oh, I did a research and this happened, we would have believed. But the way she creatively tied together with real life experience in a novel way, that's what lends the book its beauty.
Thank you, Franklyn. That makes me, that sort of comforts me. And yeah, I'm an analytical reader. And so, and I was, my expectations were not being met but your explanation is you know, really what I should have got to was just that she was creating a story, and it does have some basis of fact. So
Yeah, you're welcome.
And my apologies for not making it clear that it was a novel. We have read some, well, we read The Marrow Thieves in the very first book club last September, and that was fiction. And then we read Brahma and the Beggar Boy, which is a very inaccessible epic poem that takes lots of parsing, and it's a tough slog, and also has lots of themes that are good for life today. And then we'll be reading The Undertaking of Billy Buffon by the very Reverend David Giuliano, former moderator of the United Church, in the spring. But like Franklyn, I tend to skew towards the like nonfiction. So we have read a lot of nonfiction. That's true. And I can imagine if you picked it up and you thought it was something more like A Long Road Home or a biography about somebody, that it wouldn't feel, wait a second, partway through. The other question that came up for me, I think with your written comment, is just about, I think some of the assumptions that we make across cultures or across experiences, even around like, what is really real racism, or what is true trauma or abuse, right? So one of the first really big services that I preached at was the Celebration of Ministry service in British Columbia, the last BC conference in 2017. And again, I think because of having white skin privilege and not seeming like, unless I talk about being Indigenous or unless I share an experience of being Indigenous, that like, I think some people also just sort of like forget or think that somehow I'm not like really, really Indigenous. And I got really frustrated when I had taken over being executive director at First United, and the number of times people said to me, like, you're really lucky that you grew up like different than real Indigenous people. And I remember it was the first time that I really felt like I kind of took the gloves off when I was preaching. I was like, I'm really just gonna like preach what's on my mind. And so I said, you know, there is this nature in the church to say, because I'm, you know, grew up middle class and I have my PhD and my MDiv, my THM, that like somehow I didn't experience growing up Native in Canada the way that you expected to. And yet, like, I'm a recovering alcoholic, and my brother died by completing suicide, and my family are alcoholics, and like more people that I know have, in my extended family, have like completed suicide than many other families that I know. And I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And I didn't go to residential school, but my grandfather's abuse was so horrific that when he shared his testimony for the comprehensive claims process, his trauma was so triggered that he went into a coma for 2 months. And so like I didn't grow up poor and I didn't grow up on reserve, but other than that, like what aspect of being Native in Canada did I not experience? And I was really nervous to say this because I knew that it was going to come off a little bit heavy-handed. And I ran into a friend from this, actually Jenny Carter Franklyn, and I ran into her at the coffee shop before church, and she said, "How you feeling, Carmen?" And I was like, well, I'm gonna talk about like childhood sexual abuse in my sermon. And she said, yeah, if that doesn't go over well, just talk about menstruating. Everybody will forget that you talked about sexual abuse. But you know, I think that there's this piece of being human, and somebody else mentioned, I think Kate, about like just not really understanding the depths of cruelty in the human experience. And I think one of the reasons why we all love Brene Brown so much is her thing that like everybody has a story that will break your heart. And if you really listen, everybody will have a story that brings you to their knees. Or brings you to your knees. And you know, we can say in some ways that Wash had this life of privilege because of the protection and the taking under the wingness of Titch, but it also, you know, to have grown up witnessing that cruelty and to grow up always like waiting for the other shoe to drop, and that fear is also not experiencing racism, right? And it's not overt. So we kind of want to discount it a little bit, but like also it's very real, and that's what intergenerational trauma looks like. And it's not as if he didn't experience any trauma, it just maybe wasn't the worst. And again, like that's one of the things to me that fascinates me about the book and about the nuance in it, is there's this whole like spectrum or kaleidoscope of human experience. And I think that that's one of the things that I think is the potential of our commitment to being an intercultural church and an anti-racist church, is that like we can actually, I think we need to be more vulnerable with each other and more human with each other and less scared of saying the wrong thing or naming oppression or injustice when we see it, because the possibility of like really truly living for each other, as we're encouraged to by Bonhoeffer and others, is like so powerful. Like we need each other. And if we just show up like everything is fine and the story is okay, or everything is fine, and we don't want to share what's really hard for us in our church community, then where can we share that? But we develop empathy and the ability to love and care for each other so much more deeply, and that's what I hope for our church in reading books like this and some of the other books that we've read. Any other comments or questions? Franklyn, do you have any closing thoughts or comments? Your mic is off again.
You go.
While you're turning it on, I will say, I don't know if you guys notice, I try hard to say your mic is off rather than saying you're muted, because I've heard that like in disability circles, it's like a tossing off of muteness, right? That it actually is a condition that some people live with. And so I try to say like your mic is off, not you're muted.
It's also more factually correct.
Thank you for
the mic is off.
good reminder. Yeah. Yeah. The note I wrote here is that while the book while Walsh is fictional, the struggle he faces, escaping slavery, finding a place in a world that still sees him as an outsider, and grappling with the question of freedom identity, is still real today. As the conversation, as you were sharing, Carmen, all of those is still real today. And as we wrestle with book like Washington Black and other books that were mentioned, the duality, the nuances, the hidden questions, it's good that we pay attention to these and have dialogue with the persons who are different from us. Be brave, be compassionate, and keep ourselves, make ourselves vulnerable. As Brené Brown, one of my favorite authors, said, vulnerability is strength, and that's where humanity strives most, when we are vulnerable. So, and I will close with that. And thank you so much, Moderator Carmen. I really enjoyed it. I didn't expect to, but I really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you for taking me up on my invitation, despite your hesitations. And one of the things I love for you is you're always up for an adventure.
Yes.
So huge thank you to Franklyn. Hopefully get to see you when I'm out in PEI next month. And so I'm so sorry. I'm getting over bronchitis. So the nice thing about Zoom is I have been able to turn my mic off most of the time when I've been coughing tonight, but I'm sure you've noticed that I've got a Kleenex to my face half the time. So next month, we are pleased to have the Reverend Dr. Karen Hamilton discuss her book, Faith as Protest. And that's going to be on, I think, November 28th, sorry, Thursday, November 28th. And then in January, on January 23rd, we'll be doing Hugh Siegel's Bootstraps Need Boots. And our discussants will be the very Reverend Marion Party, who's been a very faithful attendee at our book club, as well as Hugh Llewellyn. Both Marion and Hugh have been very involved in the United Church's advocacy for guaranteed livable income in Canada, and I think had worked with Hugh Siegel when he was alive. When I started the book club, he was still with us, and a dear friend of the Reverend David MacDonald, former MP and United Church minister. And David was actually the one that suggested his book. Like me, David is a voracious reader, and we had hoped that he would be able to come, but then sadly he ended up passing away before we could get a response to his invitation. So I'm happy to have both Karen and Marion as members of the book club, but also being able to present on things that are near and dear to their hearts. So we'll look forward to seeing you both in the coming months. Karen, do you look like you have something to say about your book before we go?
I just wanted to assure Franklyn that it's nonfiction.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We have all nonfiction for the rest of our time together, except for, which month is it? February. The very Reverend David Giuliano will be discussing his first novel, The Undertaking of Billy Buffon, which has won a couple of awards in Canada, which I'm excited about. So we'll look forward. And David's been with us off and on over the months as well. And just a reminder that the book club is available for asynchronous watching too. So if you're not able to join us on a given month to discuss the book live, that the recordings go back into the ChurchX course. And I know I think we have over 400 people registered for book club now. And so there must be people who are watching it that don't necessarily get out to join us every month. But it also will stay in ChurchX as a resource. So if you want to do all of the books with a local group in your community of faith, or you want to do a couple of the books, that the videos are there for the discussant portion. Well, I mean, our whole discussions are available, but you could watch just me discussing with the invited guest as a sort of conversation starter for your own book club. And it's brought me so much joy to join all of you over the months, and keeps me reading. So I'll look forward to seeing you guys on November 28th. All right, thanks everybody, and thanks
you,
Alan
everyone.
again
Have a
for
wonderful
hosting the
night.
tech side.